Finally, in August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army of French mercenaries and English exiles. He marched into England, gathering supporters along the way. Richard III met him near the town of Market Bosworth, in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth Field was fought on August 22, 1485, and it was the strangest battle of the whole war. Richard had a larger army, but many of his nobles were secretly in touch with Henry. On the morning of the battle, Lord Stanley, a powerful nobleman with a huge army, stood aside, refusing to commit to either side. Richard realized that he was being betrayed. He spotted Henry Tudor in the distance, surrounded by a small bodyguard, and decided to end the war in one dramatic charge. He shouted, "Treason! Treason!" and led his personal knight straight at Henry. It was a desperate, reckless gamble. Richard fought like a demon, allegedly killing several of Henry's standard-bearers with his own hands. He was so close that he nearly reached Henry himself. But then, Stanley's forces, who had been waiting, finally committed, not to Richard, but to Henry. Richard was surrounded. His horse was killed from under him, and he was hacked down by the Tudor soldiers. His crown, which he had worn into battle, fell off and rolled into a bush. It was later retrieved and placed on Henry's head, the crown of England, picked up from the mud. Thus ended the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, the first king of the Tudor dynasty. He married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, uniting the two rival houses. He adopted a rose that combined the white and red, the Tudor rose, to symbolize peace and unity. And he ruled for 24 years, bringing stability and financial sense to a bankrupt and exhausted kingdom. But the story doesn't end there. Henry VII was a paranoid, calculating king. He spent his reign killing off any remaining Yorkist claimants, executing, imprisoning, or exiling them. He was so paranoid that he started a secret spy network, forced his nobles to pay heavy fines, and lived in constant fear of rebellion. But he managed to pass the crown to his son, Henry VIII, who, as we all know, turned out to be a whole other bedtime story. So, what do we learn from the Wars of the Roses? First, never leave a power vacuum, someone will fill it, usually with an axe. Second, never trust a man called the Kingmaker, he'll make you, then unmake you. Third, if you're going to murder your nephews, make sure you have a really good spin doctor. And fourth, always keep your crown on your head, otherwise it might end up in a bush. The wars also show us that medieval politics was a blood sport. Nobles didn't just compete for power, they killed each other, their children, their cousins, and anyone else who got in the way. They used heraldry and flowers as symbols, but underneath the pageantry was a brutal hunger for land and money. It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about survival. And yet, out of all that chaos came the Tudor dynasty, which gave England the Renaissance, the Reformation, and some of its greatest literature. If the Wars of the Roses hadn't happened, England might have remained a feudal backwater. Instead, it became a modern nation, albeit a nation built on a foundation of blood. So tonight, as you lie in your warm, comfortable bed, think about the thousands of soldiers who died in the snow at Towton, or the young princes who disappeared in the tower, or the mad king who was pulled from his prison to be crowned again, only to be murdered. Their lives were short, brutal, and often pointless. But they gave us our history, a history full of lessons, absurdities, and the occasional laugh. Because let's face it, the Wars of the Roses were also incredibly ridiculous. You had a king who couldn't speak, a queen who led armies, a kingmaker who changed sides like socks, a teenage giant who married a widow for love, a hunchback who may or may not have killed kids, and a Welshman who ended up as the founder of a dynasty because he was lucky enough to land on a beach at the right time. It's like a Shakespearean drama, which, in fact, Shakespeare later wrote about, only funnier because it actually happened. Imagine the scene, two armies facing each other in a field. The archers are shivering in the rain. The knights are arguing about who gets to ride the best horse. The king is praying, his queen is shouting orders, and the cannon are drowning in mud. Then someone shouts, "Charge," and everyone runs at each other, screaming, only to trip over their own feet. It's medieval football, but with sharper edges. And then, after all that killing, they'd sit down and sign a treaty, only to break it the next year. They called it honor, but it was really just stubbornness. They died for a piece of cloth with a flower on it. They killed their cousins because they had a slightly different color rose on their breastplate. But we can laugh at them now, not because their suffering was funny, but because the human capacity for folly is universal. We still make the same mistakes. We still choose sides, hold grudges, and go to war over symbols. The only difference is that we now have more efficient ways to kill each other. So, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful that you don't have to choose between a red rose and a white one. Be grateful that your ruler doesn't need to be mentally competent to keep their job. And be grateful that if someone puts a crown on your head, it's probably made of cardboard and meant for a party, not a permanent appointment. The Wars of the Roses ended over 500 years ago, but their echoes still linger. The English monarchy changed forever, from absolute rule to a more balanced relationship with Parliament, a process that would take centuries. And the Tudor dynasty gave us the English Reformation, the Church of England, and a long line of colorful monarchs, including the one who had 6 wives and a very big waistline. But that, as they say, is another story, for another sleepy night. For now, close your eyes. Imagine the snow melting on the field of Towton, the grass growing over the graves, and the roses, red and white, blooming together in a tangled hedge. The kings are gone, the queens are dust, and the only thing that remains is the quiet hum of history, telling you that even the most chaotic times eventually pass. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be free of battles, betrayals, and royal uncles with suspect motives. Good night. Parliament negotiated a compromise. Henry would stay king for life, but York and his heirs would succeed him after Henry's death. That meant York's son, Edward, would be the next king, bypassing Henry's own son, the young Prince Edward. Margaret was livid. She refused to accept that her son would be disinherited, and she fled north to gather an army. That winter, York made a fatal mistake. He underestimated Margaret. She was not a damsel in distress, she was a warrior queen in disguise. She marched south with a huge army, and York, leaving London to pursue her, met her at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30th, 1460. It was a disaster for York. His army was caught in a trap, and he himself was killed, along with his second son, Edmund. Margaret had their heads chopped off and placed on spikes above the gates of York, wearing paper crowns, a grotesque mockery. The Duke of York's head, with its half-open eyes, stared down at the city he had dreamed of ruling. But York had an eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. Edward was 19 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, absurdly handsome, and ferociously ambitious. When he heard that his father and brother had been murdered, he didn't weep, he swore revenge. He gathered an army of Welsh and English supporters and marched toward London. Meanwhile, Margaret, emboldened by her victory, was also marching south, but her soldiers were a rabble of northern roughnecks, and they terrified the people of London with their looting and pillaging. Edward beat Margaret to London. He entered the city, and the citizens, terrified of Margaret's northerners, hailed Edward as king. He was crowned Edward IV on March 4, 1461, but the crown wasn't secure. Margaret's army was still marching, and she had the support of the Lancastrian nobles. The two armies met near the village of Towton, in Yorkshire, a place that would become the bloodiest battlefield in English history. The Battle of Towton, fought on March 29, 1461, Palm Sunday, was an absolute nightmare. It was snowing heavily, with a bitter wind blowing from the north, straight into the faces of the Lancastrian archers. Edward's Yorkist archers, standing with the wind at their backs, shot their arrows farther and more accurately. The Lancastrians shot back, but their arrows fell short. Then Edward's archers advanced, picked up the Lancastrian arrows from the snow, and shot them back, a gruesome recycling program. The hand-to-hand fighting lasted for hours. Men slipped on the snow and mud, hacked at each other with axes and swords, and the pile of corpses grew so high that they formed a rampart. The Lancastrian army eventually broke and fled, but the Yorkist cavalry chased them for miles, cutting them down. The death toll is estimated at 28,000, more than the total population of many English towns. The river Wharfe ran red with blood. It was a massacre. Edward IV was now undisputed king. He was crowned again, this time properly, and he seemed to have won. He was young, strong, and popular. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful, ambitious widow from a minor noble family, which angered his chief ally, the Earl of Warwick, who had been negotiating a French marriage for Edward. Warwick felt betrayed. This was the beginning of the end of their alliance. Warwick was not a man to be ignored. He had made Edward king, he could unmake him. In 1469, Warwick rebelled, backed by Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, a jealous, scheming man who thought he would make a better king. They captured Edward and held him prisoner for a short time, but he escaped and raised another army. Warwick and Clarence fled to France, where they made a shocking alliance with the exiled Margaret of Anjou. Yes, the kingmaker, who had helped put Edward on the throne, now joined forces with his worst enemy, Margaret, to restore Henry VI, the man he had helped depose. In 1470, Warwick invaded England with French support, and Edward IV, caught off guard, had to flee to Burgundy, in present-day France. Henry VI was brought out of the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned for years, and restored to the throne. It was a miraculous comeback for the Mad King, but his reign was a puppet show. Warwick and Margaret were the real rulers. Edward IV, however, was not done. In 1471, he returned with a small army funded by his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy. He landed in Yorkshire, gathered support, and marched south. He met Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, fought in thick fog on Easter Sunday. The two armies stumbled into each other, and Warwick was killed in the chaos, literally hacked to death as he was trying to reach his horse. The kingmaker was dead, and with him, the Lancastrian cause in the south. Margaret, hearing of Warwick's death, rushed from France with her son, Prince Edward, to join the remaining Lancastrian forces. But Edward IV intercepted them at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, a brutal, decisive Yorkist victory. The Lancastrian army was shattered, and Prince Edward, the 17-year-old heir to the Lancastrian cause, was killed in the battle or executed immediately afterward. Accounts differ. Some say he was killed in the melee, others say he was captured and brought before Edward, and when he refused to acknowledge Edward as king, he was stabbed to death by the Yorkist nobles. That night, Margaret was captured. She was brought to London and imprisoned. And the poor, mad Henry VI, who had been restored to the throne but had never really ruled, died in the Tower of London on the night that Edward IV returned to the capital. The official cause was melancholy, or possibly a convenient murder. It was widely believed that Edward had ordered Henry's death, to end any future Lancastrian claims. So by 1471, Edward IV was firmly on the throne, his enemies dead or imprisoned. He ruled for 12 more years, enjoying life, women, and food. He grew fat, lazy, and complacent. He had many children, but his sons were young when he died in 1483, at the age of 40, probably from a combination of overeating, stress, and a life of excess. This is where things get really murky, and really famous. Edward's eldest son, Edward V, was only 12 years old at his father's death. The boy was placed under the protection of his uncle, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's youngest brother. Richard was a small, wiry man with a grim expression, a mild scoliosis, which was later exaggerated into a full-blown hunchback, and a burning ambition to rule. He had been loyal to Edward throughout the wars, but now, with the throne vacant and a child king in the offing, Richard saw his chance. Richard had his nephew, the young Edward V, brought to London and housed in the Tower of London, which was not yet a prison but a royal residence. He also had the boy's younger brother, 9-year-old Richard, brought to join him. The boys were seen playing in the gardens for a few weeks, and then they were never seen again. Rumors flew that Richard had them smothered in their sleep, buried under the stairs. The two princes in the Tower became the most famous missing persons in English history. No one knows for sure what happened, but Richard benefited enormously, because he declared himself King Richard III on June 26, 1483, having previously had Parliament declare the boys illegitimate, based on a flimsy claim that Edward IV's marriage was invalid. Richard III was king, but he was deeply unpopular. He was a capable administrator and a brave soldier, but he had a PR disaster on his hands. Everyone suspected he'd killed his nephews. Even his own supporters were uneasy. Meanwhile, there was another claimant, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian relative living in exile in France. Henry's claim was thin. His mother descended from an illegitimate branch of the royal family, but he was the best the Lancastrians had left. He spent years waiting, gathering support, and planning an invasion. Alright, let's sleep. Pull the covers up to your chin, fluff your pillow, and imagine you're sitting in a dusty old library, surrounded by leather-bound chronicles and the faint smell of candle wax. The year is 1485, or maybe 1455, or really any year between, because for 3 decades, England was a Game of Thrones, except with more mud, less dragons, and an alarming number of cousins trying to kill each other. This is the story of the Wars of the Roses, a family feud so epic that it makes the Hatfields and McCoys look like a tea party. It's a tale of mad kings, warrior queens, teenage generals, and a man who may or may not have murdered his nephews in a tower. It has betrayals, reversals, and a battle fought in a snowstorm so fierce that the archers couldn't see their targets, but they shot anyway, because that's medieval logic for you. So settle in. We're going to start at the beginning, which is actually the end of something else, and work our way through 30 years of absolute chaos, all because one king couldn't keep his crown, and 2 families couldn't agree on which flower looked better on a badge. Our story opens in 1453, a year that was not great for England. The 100 Years' War against France had just ended in a spectacular English defeat. Calais was the only French possession left, and the English king, Henry VI, had the kind of psychological breakdown that would make a therapist weep. He was 29 years old, gentle, pious, and utterly useless as a ruler. He preferred praying to fighting, reading to ruling, and giving away royal lands to his favorite monks. He had inherited the throne as a baby, been crowned King of England and France, though he never actually ruled France, and now, in his late 20s, he suffered a complete mental collapse. He couldn't speak, didn't recognize his own son, and spent days staring at a blank wall. This was a problem. A medieval kingdom needed a king who could lead armies, dispense justice, and, most importantly, father legitimate heirs, which Henry had done, just barely. His son, Edward, was born in October 1453, right in the middle of Henry's catatonic episode. The birth was a miracle, but it also created a power vacuum. Who would rule the country while the king was, shall we say, mentally on holiday? Enter Richard, Duke of York, a tall, angry, and incredibly wealthy nobleman who believed he had a better claim to the throne than Henry himself. York was descended from a younger son of King Edward III, whereas Henry was descended from the 4th son, but through the female line. It was complicated, but basically, York thought Henry's grandfather had stolen the crown, and he was determined to get it back. York was appointed protector of the realm during Henry's madness, which meant he essentially ran the government. He was competent, efficient, and deeply resentful that he wasn't the real king. He also had a powerful ally, his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, a man so rich and so politically savvy that he was nicknamed the Kingmaker. Warwick could make or break kings with a snap of his fingers. But the king had a wife, and she was not going to let her husband's throne be stolen. Margaret of Anjou was a French princess married to Henry VI, and she was everything Henry was not: fierce, ambitious, ruthless, and completely unafraid to get her hands dirty. She had given birth to a son, and she would do anything, to keep the crown on his head. She despised York with a passion that could melt steel. So we have two camps, the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose, Henry, Margaret, and their son, and the House of York, the White Rose, Richard, Warwick, and their allies. The seeds of war were planted, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came in 1455. Henry had recovered from his madness, temporarily, and Margaret demanded that York be removed as protector. York, fearing arrest, decided to strike first. He gathered an army and marched on London. The king's forces, under the Duke of Somerset, a Lancastrian favourite, met them at the town of St. Albans, just north of London. The first battle of St. Albans was small by later standards, maybe 3,000 men on each side, but it was the first blood of the conflict. York's army charged through the streets, and in a chaotic melee, Somerset was killed, and Henry VI was captured, found sitting quietly under a tree, having lost his army but not his composure. York took Henry back to London and had himself reappointed protector, with the king as his puppet. That was the opening act. The war had begun. For the next 4 years, there was an uneasy peace, but both sides knew that the next battle was only a matter of time. York tried to push his claim to the throne, but he couldn't win enough support. Margaret, meanwhile, was raising forces in the north, building alliances with Scottish border lords, and preparing for a counterstroke. In 1460, the war erupted again. York and his allies defeated a Lancastrian army at Northampton and captured Henry VI once more, but this time, York went further. He marched into Parliament, laid his hand on the throne, and announced that he was the rightful king. The nobles were stunned, not because they disagreed entirely, but because York had just committed the ultimate political sin. He had openly claimed the crown while Henry was still alive. It was like walking into someone's house and announcing that you owned it now.